Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be continuing our series in the Deep Blue vs. Kasparov match. Now, last video we went over Game 1 of the 1996 series, in which Deep Blue playing the white pieces actually came out with a win. Now, if you do remember, Kasparov played Deep Blue in 1996, actually ended up winning that series. They had a rematch in 1997 that Deep Blue ended up winning with some controversy. So, this series, 1996, Deep Blue goes up 1-0 initially, and so in game number 2, Kasparov is now playing the white pieces against Deep Blue playing the black pieces. Now, a few things that I want you to keep in mind while watching this is, we're going to be going over a lot of different variations, but Kasparov pretty much plays the aggressive variation in whatever the board is looking like. And he really is going after Deep Blue. He's not playing passive. He's really trying to be as aggressive as possible. So being down 1-0, you can really tell watching this game that Kasparov came out guns blazing, really wanted to come out with a W and make sure that he evened this up 1-1. Also, we'll be talking about it more, but as we move into the end game, as you can see, both sides are going to have opposite sides, opposite color bishops. Now, this is very, very important. If you haven't watched the video already on different color bishops going into the end game, definitely recommend you watch that. We're going to be talking about it more in the video, but just something to keep in mind. And then as we get into the end game, it's very interesting to watch Kasparov play because he plays very similar to a computer would, especially a supercomputer, as far as his tactical strategies, really trying to every move incrementally improve his position, and then at the end just being too overwhelming for his opponent to actually deal with. So, a few things to keep in mind. We'll go ahead and get into it. Again, Kasparov playing the white pieces and Deep Blue playing the black pieces. Kasparov is actually going to start the game with knight to f3. Very versatile move. Gives him a lot of different options depending on how black responds here. Deep Blue does respond with pawn to d5. White's going to continue d4. And then after e6, White's going to get ready to fianchetto his bishop here to g2. Really eye down on this light squares from this a8 all the way down to h1. Trying to control these light squares in the center of the board here. Black's now going to play pawn to c5. Again, top level play. Players are really trying to control the center of the board, counterattack the center of the board. So that's just what Deep Blue's doing. Playing pawn to c5. Obviously it would kind of be a mistake here to take here on c5 and then have Deep Blue play, bishop takes on c5, really gaining center control of the board, and White no longer has any pawns in the middle of the board. So instead, White's going to continue and fianchetto his bishop to the king side, as we talked about before, getting ready to castle on the king side. Again, anytime you're going to develop your minor pieces to one side, typically that's where you're going to castle and have king side safety. From here, Black's going to continue with knight to c6. Obviously, you want to be developing your minor pieces towards the center of the board, and a lot of times you will see the knights come out before the bishops. You may have here developing knight before bishops, so a lot of times their knights will be coming out to f3, c3, c6, and f6, and then the bishops will get involved into the game. Now, early on, again, minor pieces are going to be supporting the pawns, and then later on into the game, the major pieces will be supporting the minor pieces. So from here, White's going to castle on the king side, again, developing his minor pieces and then getting his king to safety as soon as Kasparov can. Black's going to play knight to f6, continuing with develop, trying to control the center of the board, really just trying to build up stuff and support his pawns right now. And White's going to play pawn to c4, trying to counterattack in the middle. Obviously, Black's playing pawn to c5 here, trying to attack this pawn here on d4, and that's exactly what Kasparov's trying to do. He's trying to counterattack this pawn here on d5, try to break up these light squares in the middle of the board here, since he does have this bishop here on g2. Deep Blue does have a few options as far as how he could take. If he wanted to, he could always take with his knight here on d4. He could always take here on c4. He could always take here on d4. But the computer opts to take here on c4, and Kasparov plays knight to e5. Now, this is actually a very common move in the Open Catalan. I'm not sure if you're too familiar with the Open Catalan. Again, it does play very similar to the reverse Grunfeld, but White's not looking to gain this material back right away, although he could if he wanted to try to gain this material back right away. But instead, Kasparov's looking to try to gain center control, be aggressive, knowing that this pawn's going to fall later into the game. As you're going to see, the knight can come here to a3. It's going to be very difficult to hold on to this pawn to c4 because this knight is again attacking this square here on b5 if the pawn ever wanted to come down to b5. So just keep that in mind. Although he is down in material, he is gaining center control and he's going to get this material back. So again, very common, but if you've never played the Open Catalan, this is going to be a common theme that you're going to see. From here, Black's going to play bishop to d7. Again, it would kind of be a mistake for Black to allow knight to come to c6, and then you're going to have triple pawns on the c file. Double pawns, you can kind of get away from that because as you can see, White's probably going to take one of those pawns. But triple pawns early on into the game, you typically want to avoid triple pawns if you need to. So Black's going to play bishop to d7, again developing his pieces. He does have the option to either bring his dark square bishop involved into the game and castle on the king side, or he could always now move his queen and castle on the queen side. Still undecided which way he's going to go. White's now going to play knight to a3, as we talked about before, eyeing down on this pawn on c4, getting ready to gain back that material, as we talked about, that Kasparov lost early on into the game. Black's now going to capture here on d4, but again, this center control is not going to be lasted for very long. White's going to play knight takes on c4, gaining back some of that material, and Black's now going to play bishop to c5, developing another piece, getting ready to castle on the king side more than likely, and also defending this pawn here on d4. From here, Kasparov plays queen to b3, eyeing down on this pawn on b7. Now, it's very hard for Black to hold on to this pawn on b7. Now, Black is up in material, so he can give this material back if he wanted to castle on the king side, which he does choose to do. He does need to make sure that he can't move this pawn forward anymore. White does have two attackers. He does have his knight here attacking this knight on c6. Also, don't forget about this bishop here on g2, controlling this long diagonal of the light square. So, obviously a mistake would be to bring the pawn to b6 or anything. The queen can't come to b6 to try to help that out. He would just get gobbled up by the knight. Now, if the rook came over to b8, trying to hone down and control this pawn on b7, White actually has a nice move. He can bring his bishop over to f4, and then this knight, anytime he wanted to, he could move, take a piece, and have a discovered attack against the rook there on b8. So in this situation, Black just decided that it would be easier just to give that material back if White wanted to go ahead and bring the queen up in the Black's house over here. Instead, Black decides to go ahead and castle on the king side, give that material back, and he does have this king side safety, and he can continue to try to control the center of the board. So White actually does have a few options here. He could have always brought his bishop over to g5 if he wanted to, pinning down this knight here on f6 to the queen, or he could, go ahead and bring his queen to b7 if he wanted to. I think in this situation, it's probably easier to bring his bishop to g5. But again, as we talked about, Kasparov is really just trying to be as aggressive as he possible, trying to get all up in the grill of Deep Blue. And so that's exactly what he does. He plays queen to b7, really trying to be as aggressive as possible with his queen right here. Black decides now to go ahead and start gobbling up some of the material in the center of the board, and he plays knight takes on e5, and White's going to take right back with knight to e5. Black's now going to play rook over to b8. He does want to kick this queen off. It is kind of a nuisance right here, and the queen's just going to come right back to f3. Kind of a nice square. Still allows this long light square diagonal to be dominated by this queen and the bishop, and this pawn here on b2 is not going anywhere. So very, very nice from White. As you can kind of see both sides, White now has this dark square bishop. He needs to get involved into the game, develop that before he's done with his development. For the most part, though, Black is done in his development. He does need to get his major piece out involved into the game, but the rest of his minor pieces are out in the middle of the board. So this pawn right here for d4 is kind of a strong point. It's very, very close to getting promoted, but as you can see, it is taking the resources of this dark square bishop here on c5, trying to defend this pawn. So this dark square bishop would actually like to be involved into the game, and he's not really doing a whole lot. He's kind of playing defense right now. Kasparov, the rest of the game, is going to be playing aggressive. Black's going to be playing more of the defensive. So just keep that in mind. From here, Black's going to play bishop to d6, again attacking this knight here on e5. And White's going to play a knight to c6. Now, White does have a few options. Keep in mind that he could, if he wanted to, just kick his knight up and take the bishop here on d7. Now, after the queen comes here, it takes on d7, White could always come to d3, centralized square. You always want your queens, your bishops to be central squares so they can hit as many squares as possible. The more moves your pieces have at their disposal, the more powerful they're going to be. So definitely a possibility for White, but Kasparov actually wanted to be a little bit more aggressive. So instead, he brought his knight and he played it knight to c6. Now, why is this a little bit different? Because now, after the exchange here, obviously this needs to be taken because White is threatening both this rook here on b8 and this queen here on d8. But after the exchange, when White recaptures, he now has his queen on c6. So even in your own games when you're looking at it and you think, you know what, it's going to be a great exchange for me to exchange my knight for their bishop, whatever you want to do, kind of look at different variations, because one variation, your queen may be in one place, where the other variation, your queen could end up on c6. So in this variation, Kasparov definitely wanted his queen to be a lot more active, definitely controlling these long, light squares in the center of the board, so that's exactly how he played. Black is now going to respond with pawn to e5. Again, this dark square bishop was kind of the main defender of this pawn here on d4, so definitely needs to make sure that this pawn is now doing something in defending this pawn here on d4. So definitely good job by Deep Blue making sure that his minor pieces are not just sitting there in the middle of the board just defending the pawns here. So White's going to play rook over to b1. Definitely wants to get ready for his dark square bishop to get involved into the game. If he were to go right away, this pawn here on b2 would be left hanging. So he definitely needs to get his dark square bishop involved into the game. So that's kind of why you see this rook over to b1. From here, the rook's going to come down to b6, attacking this queen on c6, making sure that he doesn't kind of stay in unwanted territory. You never want your queen in your own territory because he can do so much damage. You really have to worry about him of what he can do, because he can pretty much attack all of your pieces in one or two moves. So from here, the queen's just going to come back to a4, kind of a safe zone from White. And then the queen's going to come over to b8, trying to eye down on this pawn on b2. As we talked about, there's only one defender from White here on b1, so loading up on this b file. Again, anytime you have an open file or semi-open file, you definitely want your major pieces, your rooks and your queens on that file, because they have a lot of room to work with, and they definitely work well together. From here, White's going to bring his bishop over to g5. Again, as we talked about, wanted to get this rook here and then swing the bishop over to g5. Now, Kasparov definitely had a few options. If he wanted to, he could have tried to defend more on this pawn on b3. But instead, he decided that it would be more beneficial to give doubled pawns here on the f file in exchange for giving up a pawn on the queen side that he really was not trying to hold on to that much. So from here, Black decided to go ahead and play bishop to e7. Does not want to right away, exchange and get these double pawns. Later on, he actually eventually does. But right away, he plays bishop to e7, kind of a waiting move to see what White's going to do. Now, White decides to play pawn to b4, which is an interesting move. He did have a few other options. He could always play pawn to b3 if he wanted to. He could have always taken here on f6 and then left this dark square bishop here on f6. Both sides are now opposite colored bishops, but kind of just defending this pawn here on e5. Definitely an option, but instead kind of plays the more aggressive and plays pawn to b4. Now here, it's pretty interesting because both sides right now, if you actually run it through an engine or kind of study the game, it's kind of even right now. Black is equalized. Both sides, have a lot of different things they can do. But White doesn't have a huge advantage right here. So Black does have a few options. He could take with his rook here on b4. This is actually the move that I prefer. I feel like this attacks the queen here on a4, makes white kind of react to what black is doing, but instead black decides to take with his bishop here on b4, and I feel like this may have been a slight inaccuracy. I feel like Deep Blue could have probably found a better move, but all things considering, Deep Blue is pretty much dominating this b4 square. Kasparov decides, what, since this bishop's no longer defending, I'm going to go ahead and give black double pawns here on the f file. So after the pawn takes here on f6, then white's going to play queen to d7. Now, this queen here is not only attacking the pawn on a7, it's also attacking the pawn here on f7. And if he wants to, he can always come over to g4 and check the king here, and put a lot of pressure on this king on g8. So a lot of different options. Black really has to stay aware of what this queen's doing. And black plays queen to c8, making sure that the queen does not come over to g4 for check. Now, I'll say if you kind of look at this, black is up in material now. So anytime you're up in material, it's actually better to trade down. The more you can trade down, the more you can exploit your weakness, or your strength that you have in your material advantage. So, if black could, he would just give up all, his pieces and pawns and be left a king and a pawn versus Kasparov's king. So, in this situation, Kasparov definitely does not want to give up his queen. He does not want to trade down the material, but instead he wants to start being a lot more tactical with his move. So he plays queen takes on a7, again gaining that material back that he lost. From here, black's going to continue and play rook to b8, kind of bringing this rook back here so he's on line with the rest of his major pieces right here. The queen's going to come back to a4. He was kind of in a vulnerable position here on a7, kind of blocked off with this pawn on d4. Definitely wants to make sure that he's out of this pawn structure, and if he needs to retreat by any way, shape, or form, he can come back to b3, c2, rd1 right here. So definitely a nice little move right here. And then black's going to play bishop to c3. If you've watched any of my other videos, I always talk about outposts. It's very important to find a great outpost for a knight, whether it's a bishop. In this particular case, only a major piece, a rook or a queen, can kick this bishop off here on c3. Obviously, both sides have opposite color bishops, which we'll get into later in the endgame. So this is going to be a very, very important square for black, because white pretty much has no option to get this off unless he wants to exchange one of his major pieces, which Kasparov is just not going to do. So from here, white decides to go ahead and exchange rooks here on b8. After the exchange, white's now going to centralize his bishop to e4. Now this is very important. Anytime you have a bishop, you always want to centralize it so it has more squares that it can hit. Now, while this bishop here on g2 is pretty much controlling this long light square diagonal, once he comes to e4, he has a lot more squares that he can control. Now, this goes the same for a bishop as it does for a queen, as a rook. That's why I always preach, if a rook is on an open file or a semi-open file, it's a lot more powerful because it can move a lot. Early on in the game, before a rook is actually developed or you castle on one side of the board, your rook's not doing a whole lot. So it doesn't matter, even if you're up, 4 or 5 points in material, if you have a rook that's sitting there not doing anything, you might as well count that as an even game, because if a piece isn't doing anything, it really doesn't matter. So definitely want to make your pieces more powerful, and you do that by giving them more opportunity and more room to control on the board. So definitely a nice move by Kasparov to control the center of the board with his light square bishop. Now the queen is going to come to c7 here, kind of a centralizing square here. If he wants to, he can always bring his rook involved into the game. Does want to make sure that he's protecting this pawn here on f7, also allowing him to kind of hone down on this c3 square. Definitely gives him a lot more options here on c7 than it does on b8. Now the queen's going to come over to a6, attacking this pawn here on f6, really forcing black to protect this, and also he can always bring his queen back to d3, which we'll see here in a minute, allowing him to have a double attack here on this pawn on h7. So from here, as we talked about, the king's going to come down to g7, does need to protect this pawn here on f6, and white's going to continue with his plan and bring his queen over to d3, putting a double attack on this pawn here on h7. Black does have a few options here. He can always bring his pawn to h6 if he doesn't want to give this up. Again, it's going to fall if he doesn't move because he does have a queen here on d3 and a bishop here on e4, both attacking this. Or he could, if he wanted to, bring his rook over to b8. He can't bring it over to a8 because, again, white is controlling this long light square diagonal. But he could always bring over to b8 and then swing it down to b2 and then try to attack and gain back this pawn here on a2 that he's going to lose over there on h7. He does opt for the latter. In this move, he actually brings his rook over to b8, sacrifices his pawn here on h7, and then he's going to come back and get that pawn right back here on a2. So gives that material up on h7, and then he swings down his rook to b2. Now white's just going to bring back his bishop to e4. Again, nice central square for the bishop here on e4, and then the rook's going to swing over and capture here on a2. Notice that both sides are equal in material. Both sides have 4 pawns, a bishop, a rook, and a queen here. Now, as you can see, both sides have opposite colored bishops. So we'll go ahead and get into this. It kind of plays towards the end game. But if you have opposite colored bishops, you want your own pawns on the same color as your bishop. Now, typically, you don't want to block off your bishop with your own pawns, but you want to put your pawns on the opposite color of your opponent's bishop. So if black had a choice, he could move all of his pawns on dark squares. And he does that so that this bishop pretty much loses a lot of his effectiveness. Now, granted, this light square bishop is still controlling a lot of the light squares, but if the major pieces, if these rooks and these queens were to come off the board, this bishop is pretty much just negating some of the moves from the king because the pawns are no longer being attacked. So if you can in any way force it, you want your opponent's pawns to be on the same color as your bishop, and you want your pawns to be on the opposite color of your opponent's bishop. So just keep that in mind while you are playing, going into an endgame with different colored bishops. Definitely a lot of strategy as far as where your pawns should be on the board. Now from here, Kasparov starts to push. Now he's already taken this pawn here on h7, which pretty much frees up this g file and this h file. And the pawn here on f7 is actually going to make it a little bit harder for black to swing over his pieces and get involved into the defense. So white's going to take advantage of that and start to push up the board. He's going to play pawn to h4. Black's going to play queen to c8. Again, he needs to maneuver over here as fast as possible. And the queen's going to come over here to f3. Again, this bishop here on e4 is a great central square, pretty much controlling a lot of the board, a lot of the light squares on the board. As you can see, he's controlling a lot more squares than this bishop here on c3. This dark square bishop, although it is on a great outpost, is not as central as this bishop on e4. So this bishop is a much better bishop as far as his control, as far as how he can move around in the board. Definitely going to be much harder to deal with than this bishop here on c3. If we kind of look at the kings, you can see white has a much safer king than the black king right here. There's no pawns in front of the king. It's going to be a lot easier for Kasparov to chase this king around than it's going to be for black to come over and chase this king around. So king safety is so huge. This is why earlier in the game, white really wanted to even give up a pawn at one point to open up this g file and then go ahead and maneuver his pieces over to take this pawn on h7. Now from here, black's going to play rook to a1, trying to open up the door so we can start to attack the king here. Rook's going to go ahead and come over to a1. No really other way for him to hold on to that. So he's going to go ahead and exchange his rooks here. The bishop's going to come over to a1. It's not really doing a whole lot on a1. It's definitely going to need to come back over involved into the game. The queen's now going to come to h5. Definitely very aggressive move. As you can see, this light square bishop here on e4 and this queen on h5, they actually work really well together, and you're going to see that throughout the rest of the game. Whereas you can see this queen on c8 and this bishop on a1, they haven't done anything in tandem the entire game together. So anytime you're playing, you always want your pieces to work together. Very important, especially as you get involved into the end game. So the queen's going to come over here to h8. Now black would actually want to exchange pieces off. And why is that? Because as we talked about, black has a dark square bishop and he has all of his pawns on dark squares. And that's exactly what you want when you have opposite bishops opposite colored bishops going into the endgame. Typically, you don't want to block off your own bishop, but in this case, knowing that your opponent has a light square bishop, it would be completely fine for black to exchange queens off, knowing that his pawns are going to be really, really hard to attack because his opponent has a light square bishop involved into the game. But as we can see, Kasparov knows this, and he knows his queen and his position is a lot more aggressive, and so he is not going to exchange because he wants to continue attacking. The king is kind of out in the middle on g7, so he's going to refuse that and continue with his assault. So queen to g4, check. And the king is going to come over to f8. Now keep in mind this is a timed game, so after they reach 40 moves, they get additional time on the clock. So we do see some of the moves repeat. They do make sure that they don't have a threefold repetition. Anytime you have the same position on the board 3 times, it's a draw. So he definitely does not want to have that. But there are times where you will make the same move and have a twofold repetition, just so you can kind of get closer to that 40 move mark and get additional time on the game. So that's kind of what we're going to see here. The queen's going to come to c8, the king's going to come back to g7, and the queen's going to come back to g4. And now the king is going to come over to f8. And now, obviously, you can see the moves are going to change a little bit. The bishop's going to come over to d5. Now the king's going to come to e7. Now bishop c6, the king back, and the bishop's going to come back to d5. So that's kind of all the repetition that we're going to see. We have 2 of the twofold repetitions, but no more than that because Kasparov definitely does not want to draw this game. He's already down 1-0 in the series. He wants to make sure when he's playing the white pieces that he's going to come out on top with a 1-0 game. Now, if we just kind of look at this position right here, you can see that black's pieces are not working together at all. They're pretty much separated by all these pawns in the middle. The queen here on h8 is pretty much as far away from this king as possible. This bishop pretty much can do a whole lot of nothing. It's going to take him a couple moves just not to be blocked off by his own pawns. While if you look at white's position, although he does have the same amount of material, he's going to be a lot more likely to be able to attack very quickly. He can always bring his queen over to c8 if he wants to attack. His bishop here on d5 is very, very centralized. Always going to be putting pressure on this pawn on f7. So it's going to be very, very easy for Kasparov to attack, where Deep Blue is pretty much just trying to hold on and get a draw out of this game. There's pretty much no way that Deep Blue can win this game, just trying to hold on for a draw. White's going to continue. After black plays to king to e7, white's going to come over to f3, getting ready. Again, he always wants to make sure that his bishop and his queen are working together here. Now the bishop's going to come back to c3, try to centralize it as much as he can. Pretty much going to hold on to this long dark squared pawn chain with the bishop here. But again, this dark squared bishop really not doing a whole lot in the game, especially as more pieces start to fall off the board. Really just not doing a whole lot in the game. It would actually be better if the pawn and the outpost was here on d4, controlling more of the board, but alas, it is not. It is here on c3. White's now going to play bishop to c4, getting ready for his queen to get involved into the game. The queen now is going to come over to c8, trying to thwart some of this attack. Obviously, the queen can't come to c6 here or b7 as he may have wanted to. Also attacking this bishop here on c4. The queen's going to come to d5 though. As you can see, white now has a much, much stronger attack than black does. And also white has kind of blocked off any working together that black may have had for his pieces. Now, from here until the end, this is kind of what it's the end game. We've kind of been going into the end game for the rest of it. I'm going to kind of be going through the moves a little quicker just because it's all pinpoint precision. But what I really enjoy about this is Kasparov really plays like a computer. He plays, precise. Pretty much all his moves, he's just trying to gain a little bit of advantage on every single move, and over time he kind of adds up and allows himself to gain an extra pawn here. A few moves later, add a few small advantages and gain another pawn here, and then at the end he's just up too much material for black to deal with. Now if you kind of look at it, black really doesn't make any blaring obvious dumb moves. It is a computer, it is a supercomputer. There's not going to be anything crazy out of the ordinary where he just sacks a piece for no reason or does anything too crazy. But white just plays so precise that it's really hard for black to do much. He just does not have the resources to hold on to the attack that Kasparov is going to unleash on this computer. So just keep that in mind. We do have queen to e6. Queen's going to come over to b5. d7, going to check the king, going to block, trying to exchange. Obviously, Kasparov has no intention on exchanging. Queen to a7, queen to d7 here. And then queen over to a8. Pretty much not really worried about anything black can do here. Queen's going to come c7, back down to a3, getting ready for an attack, trying to get this pawn here on f7. Queen's going to come to d6. Now coming back over to a2, putting a lot of pressure on this pawn on f7. Now the pawn's going to come to f5. Again, you can start to see kind of the wheels come off for black here. Starting to put his pawns on the light squares. Definitely not something you want to do. Obviously also getting ready to give up this pawn here on f7. So white's going to take advantage, come in and take that pawn there on f7. Pawn's now going to come forward. Does want to make sure that he is, protecting this. So all of his pieces and pawns are now protected in one way, shape, or form. You do have this little duo, and you also have this little duo. The only weakness is this pawn back here on f5 that does need some defense. Now the bishop's going to come back over to h5. The queen's going to come to f6, defending this pawn as we talked about here on f5. The queen's now going to come to a3. Now we really start more of the attack from Kasparov. He is up one pawn in material. Now he's just going to continue his assault and really arrange his pieces exactly where he needs to. So king back to d7, queen a7, d8, queen to b7, d7, bishop, get the bishop involved into the game. He was kind of just hanging out until he was ready to come in and attack. Now it's a check. The king's going to come back to e7. Bishop's now going to come back to b5. Bishop's going to come to d2. The queen comes to c7. And he comes back to f8. Now, obviously, he wants to make sure that he doesn't do anything crazy. If he would have come down to e6, definitely would have been a huge mistake. White could easily just come in and play, queen to d7. Definitely going to be a lot harder for black to do anything here. Instead, he decides to go ahead and bring his king back to f8 and bishop to c4. Again, continuing the attack, getting ready to, pretty much dominate this king here on f8. Bishop's coming back. He's just kind of going back and forth, not doing a whole lot. As you can kind of see, black's just kind of waiting to get dominated by Kasparov. Computers don't really have a lot of patience back in the day. So the king's going to come to g2. Bishop now comes back to e1, trying to attack this pawn, but it really doesn't do a whole lot. King's going to come back to f1. We have bishop to c3, and then we kind of have a push from Kasparov. So pushing forward with f4, and then after the take, this is en passant. I know a lot of you are like, oh, that's not a real move. It actually is a real move. Anytime you move two spaces with your pawn, a pawn right next to it on the 4th rank, or obviously on the other side it would be the 5th rank, but the pawn can actually capture just like that. So this pawn is gone, and Kasparov is going to recapture with his pawn, and now the bishop's going to come to d2, and now the pawn's going to come to f4, trying to have this pawn chain here, getting ready to move forward on the king side of black here. So the king is going to come over to e8. Again, there's not a whole lot of great moves. This pawn here on d4 is really blocking any, aggression that black would like to have with his queen. White's just going to play c8, getting ready for an attack. And then the king comes down, getting the queen involved more into the game after the king moves. Getting this bishop, trying to attack, trying to get this pawn here on f5. Again, if he can go up 2 pawns in material, that's pretty much going to be GG. From here, the bishop's going to come over to e3, trying to control this pawn here on d4. Doesn't want this pawn to fall as well. The queen's just going to come over to f5. Now, white is up 2 pawns in material. White no longer cares about exchanging pieces. Before, Black actually wanted to exchange. It was going to be good for him, but in this situation, since White's up in material, he wants to go ahead and exchange down. He would be up 2 pawns to none if all the equal pieces were taken off the board. But Black knows that, if he were to exchange his queens, it would be game over, so he decides to decline. And then a few moves later, pretty much just setting up the inevitable, a few moves later, he is forced to take this queen here on d7. So attacking the king, there's no other way to hold on to the queen. He's forced to recapture here on d7. After the king comes to c7, bishop comes down to b5, and the computer was forced to resign. He's down 2 pawns in material to Kasparov, one of the greatest players of all time, and there's just no way for him to do anything else in the game. So definitely a fantastic game from Kasparov, especially when we get into the endgame. His precision, just to find those tiny nuances to improve his position at all times, definitely fun to watch. So hopefully you guys enjoyed game 2. We're now tied up in the series 1-1. Kasparov has done an excellent job to tie it up. So let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.